Good morning. It is officially the Christmas season. As you can see, we've spent some time this week decorating and preparing. I know last night with the parade and all the things that were going on downtown, I would imagine many of you spent some of your day in town just celebrating Christmas, kind of officially kicking it off as a community. I know lots of people have been shopping and taking care of those things as well, and just kind of all that conversation moving toward Christmas. And as we get into the season, I look so forward to worshiping and celebrating Christ's birth with all of you each weekend. We're going to begin a new series this morning that will help us kind of prepare and move toward those ends. How many of you enjoy the preparation of Christmas? Anybody? You enjoy putting up the lights, getting the trees out, hanging some of those decorations, the shopping. People like the shopping from time to time. There's some of those things that I like. There are other of those things that I just absolutely despise and try to get out of as much as possible. But I love the end of the game, right? I love being together with family and friends and celebrating Christmas. I love the feel of the holidays. It's a different feel than the rest of the year and the rest of the holidays that we celebrate. And so it's something to look forward to every year, and I trust that you are as well. There's a sense of building and anticipation with Christmas, isn't there? Some people like to jump the gun and start decorating before Thanksgiving. And I know that's a debate. And some of you have strong feelings on both sides of that one. So we won't get into that this morning. But that stems from anticipation, right? It stems from this eager desire to get to something that you love, for those who start decorating early. You know, the birth of Christ, it dawned on me this past week. The birth of Christ was celebrated thousands of years more than the celebration of it after the fact. We've been celebrating the birth of Christ for 2,000 years. But people waited for so much longer, watching in anticipation, reading the prophecies, hearing what Messiah would do and what he would bring to God's people. And they waited and waited and waited. And I think sometimes that gets lost for us. This sense of anticipation and just how long God's people watched and observed and questioned as leaders would rise. Maybe this is God's chosen. Maybe this is his elect. And then they would see that in fact was not the case for different leaders. They anticipated and waited for thousands of years. Hundreds and hundreds of prophecies were written about the Messiah, about the Christ, who God would send and how this individual would serve God's people and bring about God's kingdom. Hundreds of prophecies that talked about where the Messiah would come from and what the Messiah would do and how people could correctly identify him when he came. Hundreds of prophecies throughout the scriptures. Many others taught by rabbis and scholars that aren't a part of the Holy Scriptures, but were descriptions, so that people would know when God's elect, when his chosen one finally had arrived. Many of them wrote clearly about Messiah, giving incredible details to his life that would be obvious when somebody would fulfill those prophecies. Perhaps no one wrote more clearly than Isaiah. I think that's why we are so familiar with many of the verses that come out of the book of Isaiah. Isaiah spoke about Messiah and what he would bring, and Isaiah wrote at a pivotal time in Israel's history, a time of desperation, a time of despair or an impending doom. You see, God's people had kind of floundered in their commitment to him. They had been ruled by many kings, some of them godly and good, others wicked. King Uzziah, for instance, the man who had followed God most of his life. He had encouraged the people of Israel to worship God and God alone. He had followed after God and worshipped at the temple himself. Uzziah was a good, godly king, but he experienced great success in his reign over Israel. And over time, toward the end of his reign, King Uzziah became arrogant. He began to think of all the success as his own. He stopped giving God credit for the blessings that God had poured out on him and the successes that God had allowed him to experience. And Uzziah got arrogant and boastful. And by the end of his life, he wasn't following God like he had. Fortunately, though, for Israel, his son, King Jotham, was a godly man. Had been raised in his father's home, worshipped God alone, was committed to God. He was a good king who kind of called the people again to worship God alone and to be committed to him and living righteously. And he experienced success as well. After 2 generations, though, of godly kings for the nation of Israel, another king came along. Jotham's son, Ahaz. And as is the case often, I'm sure you've seen it in life as well, when a person grows up in a good Christian home, every once in a while they kind of rebel against that history of faith in that family. And that was the case for King Ahaz. He didn't follow after God. He didn't pursue God in any way. He pursued his own endeavors. He sought his own glory. He made his own path, and when he came to rule over the nation of Israel, he began to lead the people, the country as a whole, away from God. And as he did so, the nation, as they turned their attention away from God, we saw corruption begin to kind of ooze in to the political situation in Israel. We saw corruption in the nobles and those who had influence and power in their society. We saw people begin, as a result, to shift their attention away from trusting in God and making their own way and becoming more and more selfish as they were concerned about the climate of their nation. They didn't trust God. They had to trust then in themselves. And they began to make concessions morally and ethically as they interacted with one another. And there became kind of this season of moral decline in the nation of Israel under King Ahaz's reign. Their morality shifted. They adopted new behaviors as being acceptable that never would have been before. They saw, as they became less disciplined, not only in their morality, but in their ethics and their interactions with one another, that on the whole, they just became more and more lazy and loose in all that they did. And other nations began to rise up, and become more powerful. And they could see that there was potential trouble on the horizon as these other groups of people built wealth and power and strength, strong armies, and people grew concerned about their future. The economy wasn't stable. The military seemed to be floundering. They couldn't trust their political leaders, and people even grew suspicious of their neighbors and the intentions of those that they lived among. Trouble was on the horizon. It was certainly coming. They anticipated great suffering to come down the road. And it was in this climate that God raised Isaiah to speak to his people, to desperately try to call them back to himself. And it was in this season that God spoke directly to King Ahaz through the prophet Isaiah. In Isaiah chapter 7, we read again the Lord spoke to Ahaz. This wasn't the first time that he had reached out to him to get his attention. Again, the Lord spoke to Ahaz. Ask the Lord your God for a sign, whether in the deepest depths, or in the highest heights. You see, God wanted to prove himself. He wanted to show himself as he had done throughout history to his people. This time to King Ahaz, someone who had never really paid much attention to God, was never really interested in him. God said, ask for a sign. You ask what you want. You tell me what would get your attention, and I will show it, whether it's in the highest heights or the deepest depths. I will prove myself to you. And Ahaz's response in verse 12 of chapter 7 was, I will not ask. I won't put the Lord to this test. Ahaz wasn't interested. He didn't care about signs and wonders from a living God who desired to be involved in Ahaz's life. Interesting. When God asks Ahaz, ask me for anything you want to prove my existence to you, and I will give you exactly the sign you asked for. And Ahaz said, no thanks. I'm not interested. Just a couple verses later, we see God's response through the prophet Isaiah. Isaiah says to Ahaz in Isaiah chapter 7, verse 14, Therefore, because of your rejection of God's offer, therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. The Lord will choose his own sign, Isaiah is saying. The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and will call him Emmanuel. You see, as God's people, the nation that he had chosen for himself, he had separated out from the rest of the world for himself, the nation that he had set apart and desired to live amongst and work with, as they rejected God, as they walked away from God, and as they saw the consequence of that behavior on the horizon, God reached out with a message of hope to them in the midst of their rebellion. He offered to come and to dwell with them. The virgin will give birth to a son, and will call him Emmanuel, God with us. You see, the Lord is not only giving a sign, but he's promised to come and dwell with his people. We have 3 weeks before Christmas. We'll celebrate the birth, the coming of Emmanuel. My hope is for us as a church that we won't get so caught up in the parties and the events and making Christmas cookies and plates of Christmas treats and goodies and meals, wrapping presents, shopping for just the right gifts for other people, the coming and going and the travel and all of those things. My hope is that for us as a church, we won't get so caught up in that we don't anticipate God with us. Emmanuel, come to us. And so for the next 3 weeks, we're going to consider, what does it really mean for God to be with us? What does life look like when God himself is with you and I? The name Emmanuel, God with us, is significant. It's incredibly significant for each of us. Throughout the scriptures, we see names as being significant. They describe a person's personality and character, or what they will do with their lives. We see it throughout the scriptures. And we see it with God himself. In Isaiah, in chapter 7, we're told that God will dwell with us. But Isaiah's prophecies don't end there. He continues to describe what this Messiah will look like, what he will mean to God's people. What does it look like for God to be with us? And if we continue in his prophecy, we come to one of the most classic scriptures of the Advent season. Isaiah chapter 9, verses 6 to 7. For unto us a child is born. To us, a son is given, and the government will be on his shoulders, and he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the greatness of his government and peace, there will be no end, Isaiah says. He will reign on David's throne and over his kingdom, establishing and upholding it with justice and righteousness from that time on and forever. The zeal of the Lord Almighty will accomplish this. Isaiah is giving a message of hope. God is speaking through Isaiah to say, after your season of darkness, after my people have wandered away and will refuse to turn back to me and look on me, a new generation will raise up. Another people from these same ancestors will come along who will turn back to me, who will turn their gaze to me, who will recognize my desire to be with them, and they will respond to me. And I will be with them, and as a result, they will experience me in these ways, as a wonderful counselor, as a mighty God, as an everlasting Father, and as a Prince of Peace. That's where we're headed in our next 3 weeks. This week, next week, week after, and Christmas Eve service. We're going to look at each of these 4 names and ask ourselves, what does it mean to experience God with us as a wonderful counselor, as a mighty God, as an everlasting Father, and as a Prince of Peace? So let's look at the first one together this morning, as a wonderful counselor. Christmas is a wonderful time, isn't it? In fact, Andy Williams says it's the most wonderful time of the year. Classic song comes on early in the season. You probably will hear it 6 or 8 or maybe even 10 times a day for the next 3 weeks. Something to look forward to. But it is a wonderful time of year. As I mentioned before, there are so many things about the Christmas season that are unique to Christmas. The feel and the flavor of this holiday are like no other. There are the cozy nights in a dimly lit room with a tree in the corner, the lights twinkling, perhaps a fire in the fireplace. There's a feel to the warmth and the coziness of this season. The fragrances that permeate our homes in these days. Christmas cookies, baked goods, your favorite Christmas meals, people coming over and bringing in those classic dishes that you look forward to every year. The smells of cinnamon and other Christmas winter spices, the evergreen trimmings from the boughs on your mantle or the Christmas tree. We have a fake Christmas tree in our house. We do that for several reasons. I have some allergies to pine, so we could do a real one and I'd be miserable for 3 weeks. But we do a fake tree. But a couple of years ago, we bought evergreen scented sticks and we stick those things in that tree every year. It smells like a real Christmas tree, even though it's made of plastic. We love the smells of Christmas. We lean into the smells of Christmas, even if we have to manufacture them ourselves. There are sights, there are feelings, there are smells, there are songs that we look forward to and we will play time and time again for the next 3 weeks until we can't hardly listen to them anymore. And then there are the gatherings, our favorite people, our families, and our friends, and the people that we just invite over to our home, play games and tell stories, reminisce over the past year and talk about our hopes for the future. Now, all these things come together in Christmas. It is truly wonderful, and yet that's not what God was talking about. When he says a wonderful counselor, he's not talking about the cozy feelings that we get at Christmas, the nostalgic feelings that we get with this season. If we go back to Isaiah's prophecy, we were given indication about what God means when he says he'll be a wonderful counselor. If we look back at Isaiah chapter 7, the Lord himself will give you a sign, a miraculous sign. The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and will call him God with us. This verse, 3 different ways, tells us when God comes, when he is in your presence, you will be filled with wonder. Not wonderful and, oh, isn't this a nice, cozy moment? You will be gobsmacked at what you experience. When was the last time you were filled with wonder at something? The last time you were stopped dead in your tracks, maybe your mouth even hung open, aghast and surprise and bewilderment. Lost for words, you tried to wrap your mind around what you had just seen or heard, and words just seemed to not be able to explain or describe the emotions, the fear, the shock that you felt in that moment. When was the last time you were filled, overwhelmed with wonder? How could this be? You see, wonder can be both positive or negative, a good or bad experience. But it is the same experience in that there are moments in our life where we cannot hardly believe what our senses are telling us is happening in that moment. The Lord himself will give you a sign. A virgin will give birth to a son. You won't explain that. Wonder-filled. You see, as we read through the scriptures, we're reminded each and every time God moves in and amongst his people that God's presence truly fills us with awe and wonder. He is unexplainable when he acts in the way that only he can. Our minds reel at God's presence. Read through the Old Testament when God showed up. This is the effect that he has every time he shows up. It's the effect that he had on the Israelites when they got to the far side of the Red Sea and turned around and watched Pharaoh's entire army become engulfed with the raging waters of the sea. They had seen God work powerfully. He had already proven himself over all the gods of Egypt. God had moved them out of slavery, freed them, and not only freed them from slavery, but enabled them to plunder the Egyptians, the most powerful empire on earth, and they simply walked out into new life. They came to the Red Sea. The Pharaoh had changed his mind and sent his army to retrieve them. And in that moment, when they certainly at best thought perhaps this moment of freedom had only lasted a few hours, and already it was over, and they would be taken back to Egypt and treated even more harshly for the folly that they had made of Pharaoh, or that God had made of Pharaoh. But no, God showed up and he split the Red Sea. They walked through on dry land, and as they turned around, all threat of capture was gone in that moment, and the people stood aghast, bewildered, amazed at what God had done again on their behalf, and they began to sing a song found in Exodus chapter 15 about how incredible and mighty the Lord is. And in the middle of that song, verse 11, "Who among the gods is like you, Lord? Who is like you, majestic in holiness, awesome in glory, working wonders?" Trying to explain what they had just experienced. We see them again amazed and uncertain of how to appropriately respond to this God at Mount Sinai when he appeared to them and called them to the mountain. And they were so afraid of his presence that they chose to send Moses instead as a representative for them. And Moses went and spent time with God. And when he came back, the scriptures say that his presence, that his face radiated because he had been in God's presence. And I don't know what that looked like, but Moses was transformed in some way, that there was this afterglow of being in God's presence. And the people saw it and were so afraid that they might be struck dead by whatever was still radiating off of Moses, having been in God's presence, that they asked him to veil his face, that they might not even look on the person who had looked on the face of God. Jump to the New Testament. 3 apostles invited by Jesus to go with him and engage in conversation with the Father. The transfiguration where Jesus reveals his divine nature, peels back his humanity for just a few moments. And when it's all said and done, the 3 apostles suggest maybe we should just soak in this moment for a while. Let's build shelters and just try to figure this thing out. Try to make sense of what we have seen. We should just stay here. This was really good, Jesus. We should just stay here. Uncertain of where to go next. Or later in the book of Acts, after Jesus' ascension, when we read that Stephen, one of the apostles, was a man that was full of God's grace and his power. He performed great wonders. And because Stephen was so filled with the glory and the power of God, he became the first Christian martyr. Silenced by stoning. Because he was filled with God's presence, and as God's presence came out of him and what he said and did, those who were not ready to accept it had to silence him. This is what it means to be wonderful. When God is involved, wonderful takes on a whole new meaning. We will be filled with wonder when we see God for who he is. And Isaiah tells us that he's that kind of counselor. That he counsels us in ways that will leave us befuddled, confused at what we have just seen and experienced. He's that type of counselor, a wonder-filled counselor. One who bestows wisdom and understanding. We see this in the life of Jesus. We know him to be our wonderful counselor. At age 12, he went with his parents to Jerusalem to celebrate the festival. And after the festival was over, they all kind of loaded up their belongings with their extended family, and they all started to head home. But Jesus didn't go with them. He had wandered off like 12-year-old boys sometimes do. Every year they went to Jerusalem. When he was 12 years old, they went up to the festival according to the custom. Then a few verses later, they're most of the way home to Galilee. And they realize Jesus isn't with their traveling party. And so they go back to Jerusalem to get him. After 3 days, Luke chapter 2, verses 46 and 47. After 3 days, they found him in the temple courts, sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions. Everyone who heard him was amazed at his understanding and his answers. These were the most well-educated, spiritual, biblical scholars on the planet. They had incredible influence in their culture and in their day. These were politicians acting on behalf of the people within the Roman Empire. These are men who had studied and memorized the scriptures as they had been studied and passed down for thousands of years. It was Harvard professors meet the most powerful and influential politicians of their day. They led schools of thought. These are the best and the brightest, most brilliant human beings on the planet, or at least amongst them. And they're sitting with a 12-year-old boy who's asking questions of the scriptures that amaze them. A 12-year-old boy who has understanding of the scriptures that these men had only come to realize and be able to articulate over 20, 30, 40, some of them 50 years of study. And the insight that Jesus has amazed everyone who heard him. And his questions and his answers. They were blown away, amazed at this 12-year-old boy. His wisdom was awe-inspiring because he was wonderful counselor. He was able to give insight and direction and instruction according to the truth of God's created order that none of them could fathom how a 12-year-old boy could grasp. God's wisdom will fill you as your wonderful counselor. His wisdom and insight into life will fill you with wonder. Isaiah talks about that too in chapter 11. A shoot will come up from the stump of Jesse. From his roots, a branch will bear fruit. And then Isaiah describes this individual by saying he will be wise. In fact, he'll be so wise, Isaiah uses 7 different terms, 7 different words to describe Jesus' wisdom and insight. The Spirit of the Lord will rest on him, a spirit of wisdom and of understanding, the spirit of counsel and of might, the spirit of the knowledge and fear of the Lord, and he will delight in the fear of the Lord. These 7 descriptions of the types of wisdom that would be displayed in Messiah. The first one, wisdom, is a skill or a shrewdness to know what to say or do in any particular situation. It's a practical intelligence. You know anybody like that? They just seem to always know the right thing to do to get us out of a pickle. They know what to say to help a situation move forward when it gets stuck. Practical intelligence. The next word that Isaiah uses, the spirit of understanding. This is a discernment between two things, to observe a situation, to make sense of all the moving parts, to be able to find the middle ground where all of that input comes to overlap, to find the truth in all of it that ties it all together. Judgment and perception, an ability to sense what is unseen based on what is seen around it. Spirit of counsel, the ability to look at a situation and come up with a plan, an administrative ability to sort out the details and put together steps or direction through a situation. Isaiah says he'll have a spirit of might. It's a wise mastery of a situation or a strength and a vitality, a power that just seems to push through the most confusing or difficult of situations, a wisdom that just keeps momentum moving in the right direction. A street smarts that allows you to overcome. Spirit of knowledge. An indescribable perception or awareness of what is seen. The ability to make sense of what is seen or heard or understood from the 5 senses. Brilliant scientific abilities, to take what we see from our senses, a spirit of knowledge, as Isaiah says. The sixth one, a fear of the Lord, a spirit of the fear of the Lord. This expression, fear of the Lord, we find often in the Old Testament. It's not a shaking in your boots type of fear from watching a scary movie, but it's an awe, a respect, and a reverence, and an appropriate sense of respect for an authority. It's induced by what you've experienced from a person or a situation, and it moves you to be acutely aware of where you are and who you are in that moment, where all of your senses set their attention to this thing or this person, so that you can take in as much information as possible, because you deeply respect the authority or the power or the potential in that person or that thing. A situation where you realize perhaps you are in grave danger, and so you set all of your senses to what's happening in that moment. Or an individual who you realize has such strength and authority and power in that situation, you give them your full and undivided attention out of reverence for their position or their power or their control over your next steps. These are the types of wisdom that we're told come in the presence of the Lord, that the one promised to God's people would exhibit all of these. I know individuals who maybe exhibit one or another. Rarely do you see people cross over these different types of wisdom. Book smarts or street smarts. The ability to fall into a pile of manure and come out smelling like a rose. There's a wisdom in that. A discernment to just know what's going on behind the scenes, even though you may not be able to see there. All of these come together in Messiah. When the Lord is present, his Spirit moves in wisdom and discernment. But he moves in other ways as well. Isaiah tells us that when God is present, that his plans will also fill you with wonder. That his direction through or forward will often amaze you. Back to Isaiah chapter 9. To us a child is born. To us a son is given, and the government will be on his shoulders. And he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the greatness of his government and peace, there will be no end. He will reign on David's throne and over his kingdom, establishing and upholding it with justice and righteousness from that time on and forever. You think about when Jesus came, under the heavy hand of the Roman Empire, born to parents who were insignificant in their society, unknown to anyone of note or mention. Jesus was born to a simple family in a corner of the Roman Empire that was largely a pass-through region. And yet out of it, this wonderful counselor amazes people with his understanding, with his insight, with his care, and mostly his way. As Jesus ministers to the people in Galilee and Jerusalem, people are overwhelmed by his way, by how he interacts with those who have great need, with those who stand opposed to him and bring conflict to the forefront. They're amazed by his way, no matter who he's speaking with, great or small, knowledgeable or simple, godly or anything but. God's way, God's plan, God's path forward fills with amazement. And the zeal of the Lord, Isaiah says, the zeal of the Lord, God's passion, the fire within his soul will accomplish this. Psalm 32 says, I will instruct you and teach you in the way you should go. I will counsel you, God says, with my loving eye on you. Don't be like the horse or the mule, which have no understanding but must be controlled by bit and bridle, or they won't come to you. The Lord says, I will counsel you. I will direct and guide you. I desire to show you a path through based on my understanding of this situation and the next. Based on my perfect knowledge of all that is happening. I will counsel you and guide you. Don't push against it. Don't rebel against it like the horse or mule. Don't force a different path. Also, Proverbs 19:21. Many are the plans of the person's heart, but it's the Lord's purpose that prevails. You see, this Advent season, we've been given an invitation to anticipate God with us. An invitation to invite God with us, which means we are in the presence of a wonderful counselor, God who offers his wisdom within his presence, a God who wants to walk in perfect wisdom and knowledge and understanding of all of creation with you and I. God with us means that he is moving toward his perfect-willed end, and he wants to walk with you into it. He invites us to go with himself. And we saw it played out in his Son, the wonderful counselor. And Jesus showed us what it looks like to have full love and empathy for everyone. The outcast, the enemy, the insignificant, and the learned, all alike. Jesus showed us what it looks like to be wonderful counselor, to be guided by God's wisdom in every conversation and every interaction, every activity, and every behavior. In his conflict with others, in his service of others, in his sacrifice for others, and all that he was, we have seen the wonderful counselor. Because he didn't push against, he didn't buck against God's system, but he embraced it. The wise path is the one that goes with God to the perfect will of God. Will we embrace and look forward to that type of interaction and relationship with the one who has come to live with us and promises to dwell in us if we will simply accept him as Emmanuel? Let's pray. God, we thank you for the morning, for the opportunity to worship you, to consider what it means to walk in wonder-filled counsel. God, you give direction and insight. You walk with and move and push and nudge us in appropriate and proper ways. You speak to our souls in the midst of heartache or frustration or disappointment or conflict. And it's in those moments we have opportunity to respond to you. To submit our own selfish indulgences, our own specific agendas, our own human tendencies. We have the opportunity in those moments to submit them to yourself. God with us, may we do just that. May we listen for, watch for, and submit to your wonder-filled counsel as we go through this season. May we practice it in these days with busy shopping centers and filled streets, pressures and financial responsibilities or temptations. God, help us Help us to respond to your counsel in perfect obedience. Amen.
Because you healed my heart, you changed my name, forever free, I'm not the same. I thank the Master, I thank the Savior, I thank God. I saw Satan fall like lightning, I saw darkness run for cover, but the miracle is my testimony from death to life. 'Cause grace rewrote my story. I'll testify by Jesus Christ the righteous. I'm justified. This is my testimony. Oh, I'm alive. This is my testimony from death to life. 'Cause grace rewrote my story. I'll testify by Jesus Christ the righteous. I'm justified. This is my testimony. This is my testimony. Oh, 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 oh.
How deep the Father's love for us, how vast beyond all measure, that He should give His only Son to make a wretch His treasure. How great the pain of searing loss. The Father turns His face away, as wounds which mar the chosen one bring many sons to glory. Behold the man upon the cross, my sin upon His shoulders. Ashamed, I hear my mocking voice call out among the scoffers. It was my sin that held Him there until it was accomplished. His dying breath has brought me life. I know that it is finished. I will not boast in anything. No gifts, no power, no wisdom. But I will boast in Jesus Christ, His death and resurrection. Why should I gain from His reward? I cannot give an answer. But this I know with all my heart: His wounds have paid my ransom. Why should I gain from His reward? I cannot give an answer. But this I know with all my heart: His wounds have paid my ransom.